Sure. Tracy, you don't have sharing turned on.
I will do that first. Uh, I forget that we use Google Meet so often that I never think about sharing. You should be a co-host now, Abby.
Cool. Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm Abby Chrisman. I am a principal city planner with the City and County of Denver in landmark preservation. And then I also teach in the architecture program and preservation program at CU Denver. And I am also a trainer and on the board of the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. So Tracy asked me to come speak today, and so I'm kind of pulling a lot of different resources from some of those different aspects of what I do. So today I was really going to focus on looking at buildings and really getting their story. So using context and surveys and building research to really tell the story of your main street, and then talk a little bit about how to recognize historic buildings and to do local and national designations. So as Tracy mentioned before, started out, we kind of talked about what I should cover, and we were also talking about covering architectural styles and covering the evolution of Main Street, and then my presentation got really long. So I think we decided to split that off. So I'm going to talk about more context surveys and designations today. And then I am happy to come back in the future and talk about architectural styles and the evolution of Main Street buildings. So today I'm really going to focus on looking beyond just the architectural significance. So often when we look at historic main streets or other historic buildings of any kind, kind of the first thing that often grabs us is the architecture. And architecture, that's lovely and fabulous. And I love talking about architecture, but there's also a lot of other stories behind the architectural significance and other reasons why we would want to recognize and designate buildings. So I'm going to really focus on some of those today. And this is totally informal, so feel free if you have a question about anything to unmute yourself and just ask me or stick a question in the chat. So what can a building tell us about a community's history? Buildings can really tell us quite a bit. They're kind of the primary artifact that we have, this kind of living artifact of previous generations. So they really reflect the culture of the time that they were built, what resources were available, often was how connected were they on the railroad, what resources were they able to get, how prosperous was a town is really reflected in its architecture. The types of buildings that were built and the styles can also really reflect community values, reflects the economy, the technology of the time as we see the evolution of building technologies. And there's a lot of hidden stories of residents and businesses that we can get bits and pieces of when we really look and examine the buildings. So I'm going to start with talking about historic context. So historic contexts are written documents that really kind of distill into a concise and usable format of a community's collective knowledge about places. It can be focused different ways. Sometimes they're focused on a particular area of a town. So you might have a context that's just on the development of Main Street or the development of, commercial industry. You might have one that's on a particular time period. So something like we're going to look at the 19th century or we're going to look at mid-century. You could have contexts that look at a particular community. So, looking at Hispanic residents, our Chinese residents. So there's really a lot of different ways that you can look at context, but really what a context does is provide all the background. So why was a building built the way it was? Why did a particular group use a building? Why did they build the building? So historic context give you that broader history. And so if you do a context first and have a good context for your community, then it makes it a lot easier to identify specific individual resources that might be associated with that context because you've gotten the big picture. You know how the town developed, when people arrived, these kind of stories, and then you can look for those stories in specific buildings. So when we're talking about looking beyond just the architectural significance, contexts are really key because they dig more into those stories. So it's not just taking the building at face value, it's really looking beyond that. And context can be really key to identifying places that are culturally significant. So really, sometimes the places with cultural significance are only known to the community for which they're really culturally significant. Something may be really significant to a Hispanic community, Chinese community, American Indian community, and it may mainly be that community that knows about the legacy of a particular building and what used to be there. And so if the person, if you've had surveys done in the past and the person doing that survey wasn't affiliated with that community, they may not have had access to any of those stories. And so those buildings may not have been previously documented. So that's why it's really key when doing a context to make sure that you have community engagement. And it's a great way to be able to kind of collect a lot of community stories through a context project. So cultural associations may not be obvious from the outside of a building, or can even sometimes have been purposely hidden. So this is an image from a context study that was done in DC of LGBTQ history. And this is showing historic venues for drag shows. I don't think any of us would look at these buildings and immediately think, oh, that was a historic drag venue, because it's not obvious from the outside. And so it's one of those things that you really need to know, know the community, talk to the community to realize these other histories that may be hidden. And you may need to really research into past uses in order to know what's really happened in this building over time. Often, also, we can have culturally significant buildings that really may not look like a lot from the outside. So they often get overlooked in architectural surveys where we're really, focused on the prominent architectural styles. And we may miss significance when it's more about the story than the building. So this is a Mexican restaurant in Fort Collins that was put forward for designation because of being the, oldest still operating Mexican restaurant. But if you just were doing an architectural survey, you might very well overlook this building as thinking, well, it's altered, it's pretty simple, that probably doesn't have any significance. And ideally, when we're doing these larger contexts, we're also then pairing context with surveys. So the context really gives you the big picture. It helps you see, what are the various influences, what's the history over time, and then with an individual survey, you can, really get down to identifying specific building details and see what buildings, are associated with a particular context. So we'll dig then into cultural resource surveys. So there's really three primary survey types. So what we refer to as reconnaissance level, or sometimes windshield, because it's just kind of a drive-by. Those are just aimed at, looking at everything within a particular area. So you may do a reconnaissance survey of a particular street or a neighborhood. And you basically, that's your kind of planning. That's your kind of to see what's there. So you're just kind of going down the street, photographing all the buildings, recording basic information. So you're generally going to, do things like maybe what's its type. You might pull some information from a city assessor to see what the date of construction is. And it's an idea to give you a general idea of, okay, kind of what are the time periods we're dealing with? What types of buildings do we have? And then you can use that to identify, well, which of these do we think has real, potential greater significance. And then you can use that kind of recon level to then plan a more intensive level. So intensive level surveys are generally more selective. They're focused on the buildings that you think really need some research to dig into their history. Intensive level survey includes more detailed photographs, site plans, and historical research on the development of the property, who owned the property, and then it includes some evaluation of the property to see whether or not it could be eligible for designation. And then we also have survey updates. So survey updates are done when we have an area that's either already been designated. The one at the bottom here was from Central City survey update I did. So you're looking at, here's the whole area that's designated, but this designation was done several decades ago. So what's the current state? How has the community evolved since then? And you're looking at things like wanting to take new photos, so you have comparison photos. Really making sure, have there been dramatic changes? Are buildings still significant that were significant before? Have some lost some of their significance? But then also looking, are there buildings that weren't considered before that maybe have gained significance? Things that because, you initially did the designation in 1980, well, you weren't considering anything from the 1950s significant. And now we would think of those resources as significant. So when you're doing a recon survey, you get this kind of big picture. So this is just an example from a recon survey that I did in Hexton, Colorado. So you can see this is kind of given the big picture of how the town developed and what the construction dates are of buildings in town. And now it's great with technology. You can also integrate surveys with GIS. So this is that survey update I mentioned that I did for Central City, and it's looking at contributing and non-contributing, but this is all integrated into the GIS system so that information is available for anyone looking, doing searches in GIS. So then when you're doing intensive research and survey, you're going to place that property that you're surveying in a context. You're going to research it and evaluate it. So you're going to find out who built it, what year, what's the story behind it, who are the significant people associated with it. And then you're going to evaluate whether or not you think it would be eligible for designation. But pretty much more survey is always needed. So just because you have done a survey does not mean it's over. Surveys always need updating. Particularly, I think we're to the point now that a lot of communities did, surveys in the past that may now be several decades old. And really, it's just good practice to kind of update surveys. Good practices every decade, but I'd say at least like every 2 decades. Key part of managing, wanting to have those, comparison photographs, wanting to be able to evaluate new resources that may now be historic, and kind of, good time to kind of evaluate how preservation is going in your city, and see, how the resources have been treated over time. So survey updates can be used to identify additional resources that might be eligible for designation, particularly, looking at things that may have been overlooked because they're more recent. But it can also look at things like, do you need to expand a period of significance? So most commercial districts, anything listed in the National Register is listed with a period of significance. And that is generally, kind of the prime period when the businesses were being developed. But with the National Register, typically that period of significance is cut off at 50 years. So it means, if your designation was done a while ago, it's going to have an earlier period of significance. And if you have more recent, resources from the 1950s or 60s that you'd like to include in your district, you can do that, but you need to do a designation update with a new period of significance. You could also decide to, revise boundaries, either, enlarge boundaries to include things that weren't included before, or you might want to cut back boundaries. If you included resources that are now a parking lot and you decide that it makes more sense to take those out. And then you may want to change the status of individual resources within a district or within previous surveys on, what's contributing and non-contributing. And a lot of that can change based on the fact that a lot of things that, if a survey was done in the 1980s, they would have looked at buildings like these and decided they were not significant, not contributing, did not have as much significance because of alterations. But now, all of these alterations that we're seeing here on these buildings are more than 50 years old. And so these are alterations that we would consider as having kind of gained their own significance. So, alterations to storefronts, putting on slip covers, putting on permastone, those are all things that now wouldn't have to preclude a building from being considered significant and being considered, part of a contributing part of a downtown district. One of the other things we also look at when we're looking at survey updates is considering different context. Things that were once common may have become rare. Maybe you once had a lot of historic gas stations in your town and now you only have one left, which increases the significance. And there's also a lot of new areas of significance, things that when surveys or designations were being done in the past weren't things we were really thinking about. So they weren't thinking about post-World War II development, looking at suburbs, schools, modernization and mid-century alterations to main streets. Weren't thinking of things like redlining and civil rights and the Cold War, urban renewal projects, and even historic preservation. So historic preservation itself is now significant. And, I've gotten a complex listed on the National Register partly for its significance to the early historic preservation movement. So you can even look at, early preservation projects in your communities may themselves be, significant as a preservation project. So throughout, preservation now has been around since the 60s, and why we preserve has really changed. And so what we preserve is really shaped by why we preserve. And so for each community, you may have different motivations, and that's going to really influence what you're looking at when you're doing surveys and determining eligibility. Looking, is it to celebrate, to commemorate, to want to revitalize, to remember, to represent, to just reuse. And so really thinking about that as you're working on context and surveys. We really have huge changing views of what we consider significant has really changed over time. Again, if we go back to that kind of 1980s, what we're looking at then, a lot of what gets designated is properties like the Queen Anne on the left. It's the really architecturally significant buildings, those prominent buildings in town are a lot of what is getting designated. But now the property on the right, that is a park structure that was, built much more recently than that and was recently designated a Denver landmark for its association with Chicano history. And so we're really kind of have a different idea. A lot of the designations that are being done now are looking much more, beyond just the architecture to that cultural history as well. So now I'm just going to run through a case study to kind of give you an idea of the ways that you can uncover kind of those hidden histories in a building. So this is 2126 and 2130 Arapahoe Street in Denver that I did research on. So, I think a lot of us, if we just saw these buildings here, we'd be like, yeah, okay, maybe those were nice ones. They've been pretty mucked with. Maybe they've, been mucked with so much they've lost integrity at this point. Well, we could probably just let them go. Is there really anything important here? But they really looked quite different once upon a time. So you can see here on the left, they're the ones at the end past this really large, elaborate building, which is Turner Hall, which was a performance space. You can see also, fascinatingly, Turner Hall burned in a fire, but some of its first floor was preserved. And so some of that garage that you see there on the right, part of that is the beams and the facade of Turner Hall. And then beyond it there, you see the two buildings that I was researching. So here again, you can kind of see from the other angle what these buildings looked like originally. So, there's a cornice that's missing, a lot of windows missing, some storefronts and trim missing. So these buildings have definitely had, a rough time of it. But there are a lot of great stories kind of hidden within these buildings. So some ideas beyond just looking for historic photographs that you can uncover these histories. So a really great resource is looking at Sanborn maps. So Sanborn maps were fire insurance maps. And so they were pretty detailed. They indicated, they have you can find whole codes that are keys to identifying all the codes on the map, because they all, they identified materials and use, because that was all really important for insuring a building. And so these were maps, used to insure and used for, fire departments to be able to know, what is the roof material? What is the function of this building? If it's an industrial building and storing chemicals, we need to know that when we are responding to a fire there. And Sanborn maps were done for most communities throughout Colorado. You can also often find them through libraries. And they're just a really great way to be able to understand kind of the evolution of, commercial areas and residential areas over time. And what you can see here, I have the red block around the properties I was researching. But what you can see here is this was a residential area. So this is kind of well within what we would consider downtown Denver now. But at this time, 1890, this area was still residential. So you could see that big hall that you saw in the historic photos, Turner Hall, that hall has been built. But you can see that the rest of the street is still residential because there's a D on the property. So that D stands for dwelling. So that tells you that the rest of this street was still residential. So you can kind of see, okay, maybe this is they've put in this big performance hall in a middle of a residential block. So this seems to kind of be a block that's undergoing some transformation. So you can see here at this point, it's still mainly still residential. But if you look at kind of the properties I'm researching, so 2130 was still a dwelling, but you can see 2128 now has a store constructed in front of a dwelling that's on the rear of the lot because it has an S. So S stands for it being a store. And so you can see, okay, so it's, starting to change. So then you can see here, 1904. So you still have a lot of residential here, but you have the store, the rest of it still dwellings. And here you see more businesses. So you can see both of the buildings I'm looking at, they're both now stores, though one of them is indicated as being vacant. You can see also on this street, you have a steam laundry, you have a store with a dry cleaner behind it. Over on the other end, you have a drugstore at the corner, you have a repair shop, and somebody's selling door and window screens. So you can see kind of very much it's block in transition. So at this part, the Turner Hall has burned down. So Turner Hall has burned down. And so where the Turner Hall once was, you can see now it's a motor freight station. And you can see there's still a few dwellings left, but more commercial. There's a restaurant, there's a couple hotels. So you can see more of the businesses. And you can see then one of the ones I'm researching has a store in the front and has a plumbing facility in the rear. And then you have a sash and door factory next door. Then by 1961, you kind of have the beginnings of urban renewal. So a lot of the block has just been cleared for parking. So it's just using auto parking where the Turner Hall once was. You have more parking down at the end of the block. But the two buildings I'm looking at, they were still stores at this time with a plumbing business to the rear. So going through those Sanborn maps, then that really helps me get an idea of, kind of how the block developed, when my buildings were constructed, and what they were used as. And sometimes you can even find business names listed on the Sanborn maps as well. So to find more information, I then started doing research into, looking at the various newspaper databases that are available and looking for advertisements. So I found some great advertisements that gave me an idea of how these were used, that they had rooming houses and hotels and cafes in them. And that also, kind of tied here, you can see Palmer House, and that it was headquarters for traveling and theatrical people. So this made a lot of sense when it was Turner Hall next door and it was a performance space. So that would make sense that you then, had a hotel that was catering to theatrical people next door. And you can see then that it evolves into being one that is primarily then serving the Black community. So you have some advertisements here for the Deerfield Hotel. So it did have an association with Deerfield, Colorado, one of the same proprietors, which Deerfield, Colorado, if you're not familiar with it, early African-American community. And then you also, some of these advertisements were ones I found in specifically Black newspapers. So looking in those other community newspapers and finding these advertisements then gave me an idea there of kind of, how the businesses changed over time and who, the businesses were serving. And then I also found some great newspaper articles that gave me some clues too. This one is from about someone who shot a police officer in what was called a Negro dance hall at 2128. So that gives me, kind of clear what the use of the building was at this time. And another one with the owner of the Deerfield Hotel asking for the police to pay damages after they raided his property. So getting a little bit more about, some of the people and stories involved. So at various times, both these buildings had, were kind of hotels, kind of temporary lodging, rooming houses. So you can also get some information about who lived there by the want ads. So these are all from, people that were living in the building, who are all, identifying themselves as colored, and looking for work. So that gives us an idea too, that these, at this, time period, then these were buildings that were primarily occupied by Black residents. Then looking at city directories is also an awesome source of information. Often, city directories will often tell you what the occupation was of somebody. And then often you can also compare the city directories with census records, looking at ancestry, which includes a lot of city directories are listed on Ancestry. And so then you can kind of, between Ancestry and city directories, kind of piece together often a story of a lot of people. And this really tells us a story here, looking at who is listed as living here in the directories, this was primarily, occupied by Black residents, and a lot of them were porters. So this makes sense because this is near the railroad station. And traditionally, that was a very common job for Black men, were to be porters on overnight sleeping cars. And so this tells you, okay, so this is kind of one of the primary places where the Black porters were living. So it gives us much more of a story, kind of in significance of this building. And then next door, we're, doing these. I was able to find a really interesting history that said, going back to as early as 1921, has a real history with the Japanese community, which was also then starting at this time to move into this neighborhood. So you see that with Frank Nishi, and then you can see some of the others, Oka, Okawa. So you start to see Japanese names mixed in. And then you start to see them, some of the businesses being run by individuals with Japanese names. And then if you look through some other directories and compare that with obituaries, which can really be helpful as well. So you can see Bonji Minda ran the Minda grocery store, and that he was part of the Japanese community, and had a funeral at the Japanese Methodist Church. So that's just kind of an example, giving some ideas of some of the resources to look at, how you can kind of piece together histories of properties through using kind of maps and directories and photographs and stories. So I'll wrap up then with talking some about designating historic properties. So what is designation? Designation is really a recognition of a resource's significance. So properties can be designated at the local level, So if you have a local preservation commission, then and have a local register of properties, and you can designate at the local level. The state of Colorado maintains a state registry of historic properties. So there's state designation, and then there is also national designation. So in Colorado, we have 3 different levels that we can designate properties at. Designations can be honorary, or they could be regulatory. So they could be ones that they're just honoring a property, or it could be something that once you designate the property, then there's going to be regulation about what you can do with the property. Review process, typically to do a designation, there's going to be some kind of application form, some kind of evaluation criteria, and then inclusion with a collection of properties. So designations can be done for individual buildings. They can be done for sites, a particular site where something happened. They can be done for structures, such as a water tower, objects such as a sign. You can have linear districts, such as a railroad corridor or a significant roadway. You can have historic districts, collections of similar properties, and then you can also have traditional cultural properties. So the National Register. So the National Register is kind of the official list of the United States of properties that are considered worthy of preservation. The National Register was established to coordinate and support public and private efforts to identify, evaluate, and protect historic resources, with a goal of kind of fostering a preservation ethic, increasing appreciation of historic properties. The National Register is managed by the National Park Service, and it's really the National Register that kind of established the framework that we use generally in the US to kind of evaluate buildings, even when we're working on the state or local levels. So there's often a lot of confusion between what it means to be listed on the National Register and what it means to be designated locally. So going to talk about those differences just to, make sure everyone's clear. So the National Register, that's done by the National Park Service. But a property does not have to be nationally significant to be on the National Register. A property can just be significant to your local community and still be listed on the National Register. National Register designation is completely honorary. So a private, citizen can designate their property, and they can decide to change it the next year. They could decide to demolish it the next year, and there's no regulation to prevent that because the National Register is just honorary. So it doesn't prevent changes or demolition. The only regulation that comes with the National Register is for the federal government itself. So the federal government has to take into account the National Register. If a property is designated on the register or eligible for the National Register, federal agencies are supposed to take that into account when they're doing projects, or when they're looking at federal permitting or federal funding. But that's the only when federal government is involved is there any regulation. Listing on the National Register does require property owner consent, or if it's a district, it requires that the majority of owners in the district agree to be listed. There's no owner restrictions, so you can alter, expand, or demolish buildings on the National Register. And the National Register includes a lot of archaeological resources in addition to historic buildings. So local designation. Local designation, that is designated by your local ordinance. So if you have a historic preservation commission or if you're a certified local government, you can write your own ordinance that says what your process is going to be for designating buildings, and you can establish your own criteria. So those criteria generally roughly follow the National Register model, but you can add additional criteria. For example, a lot of local communities may just have a criteria that it's a really, visible landmark in the community, that it has geographic significance for, like, this is where you are in town when you see this building. Or they may have a criteria that's something like it's a source of pride for the community. So communities can really set their own criteria when it comes to local designation. Local designation often includes regulation. Again, that's up to the community. So a community can decide to just have honorary designation or to have optional design review. But the majority of local designations come with regulations. So the majority of locally designated properties go through design review. So it's really at the local level where communities have the power to, really physically preserve buildings. It's at the local level that they have the power to say what they think is appropriate changes and to say that a property can't be demolished. Local designation often requires property owner consent, but may not. That's something that's up to the community to determine whether or not they want to require owner consent. And there can be a lower bar for designation. Again, that's really up to the community. The community can decide how difficult they want it to be to designate local buildings. And communities can decide whether or not they want their designations to either prevent demolition and to say you can't demolish designated properties, or in some communities to delay demolitions and say, there's going to be a 90-day delay while we look at other possibilities if somebody applies to demolish a designated building. And local designations are mostly buildings and districts. Most cities don't get as much into archaeological resources, though there are some that do. Okay, so you have that, building you're thinking about designating, you may be thinking about national, or state, which I'll say the state is really similar to the National Register, but it's not. In Colorado, the state register is not quite as high a bar. So you can get something listed on the state register when it's not quite as old. It only has to be 30 years old to qualify for the state register. And you can also designate on the state register if, it has a few more changes, has been more altered, may be eligible for the state register. But all layers of designation in Colorado allow you to apply for the state historic preservation tax credits. So the Colorado state tax credits, you're eligible for those if you were designated at the national, state, or local levels. You can get those state historic preservation tax credits. So the National Register process for determining what's eligible is the same process that's followed by the state register and for the majority of local registers as well. So first, to think about, is it significant? So what area of local, state, or national history is it associated with? Does it represent an important element of that history? And how does it illustrate that history? And then second, does it have the integrity to convey that significance? So does the property possess the physical features necessary to convey the history with which it's associated? So for example, the buildings on the bottom with the 1960s slip covers. If it's a historic district that is focused on telling the story of commercial development from 1890 to 1920, well, then these wouldn't be eligible as part of it because they don't tell the story of they don't have the integrity to convey significance of commerce from 1890 to 1920. However, if you had a Main Street, area that you were trying to tell the significance of the history of commerce from 1890 to 1970, well, then these would have that integrity. They would have the integrity to tell that history. So a lot of whether or not a building has integrity depends on, what the period of time is that, you're trying to make a case for significance. So when we talk about integrity, what are we referring to? So the National Register sets up 7 areas of integrity: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So to retain integrity, a property should possess most of the aspects. But determining which aspects it needs to retain will depend a lot on why the property is significant. So if you're listing a property for its architectural significance, well, then it really needs to have integrity of design and materials and workmanship, those things that are really associated with its architecture. But if you are designating a building, for its significance as a community hall where a lot of community events took place, and so it's really cultural significance. So in that case, it's probably the location, the setting, the feeling, and association that are going to be most important. So really what you're looking at is that the property still has the ability to both convey why a property is significant as well as when it was significant. So when we're thinking about trying to get outside the box and not just think about architecture and think about other resources we might want to designate, that's where some of these kind of integrity challenges come in. But in recent years, the preservation community has really been rethinking how we consider integrity so that we can, tell the stories and designate the properties associated with the stories of a much larger group of people, so that it's not just, the rich white men that get their properties designated because they're the high style architecture and really intact. So making sure that we can kind of tell the cultural history of the whole community. So often preservation has really focused on materiality, that it has to have those historic materials in place. But I think much more now when we're looking at cultural significance, we can really look beyond. It's not always the materials. If the overall form and the location is intact, that may be enough to convey significance. Because, when we're thinking about integrity, it may not be able to fully, address places with cultural significance, and it can be a barrier to telling stories, particularly when it's stories of communities that have limited access to funds and don't always have, the money for upkeep. This is a really significant theater in Denver, associated with the Chicano community. But, sometimes, these often communities that have been historically excluded didn't have as much access to resources. And so, they may not be as in pristine shape as some others. Simple building types and places, especially buildings associated with working class and immigrant populations, really change over time. If you think about restaurants, every new restaurant owner really wants to come in and put their own mark on it. And so, there's often going to be change over time. But if you still have the building and you still have some of those associations and those histories, I think that's a reason often to think about overlooking, some of those kind of surface changes, or to consider, has it gained significance? Is it significant, because of the new paint job telling the story of the Ethiopian community? And so often then we also have to look beyond just the typical period of significance. So these are some images of the La Alma Lincoln Park Historic District in Denver. Um, this district has a long history. And if we had solely been looking at, did it have pristine examples of its early history, which started in the 1880s, we probably would have decided that this neighborhood didn't have the integrity to be designated. But instead, we also wanted to include the history of the Chicano community that lived here in the 1960s and 70s. So we did a period of significance that extended from the 1880s to the 1980s. And so that meant all these various changes, a lot of them were all within the period of significance. So they were no longer an issue for integrity because they were all part of the story. I think in areas like main streets can also be a problem sometimes when communities just want to keep, they appreciate the buildings that are considered pretty and may not appreciate some of the later mid-century modern slip covers or other alterations that were done. And, may have that kind of understandable, that bias for that architectural significance. So really kind of working to look beyond that and, recognize this as really excellent example. I love this building. So, such an excellent example of a well-done mid-mod storefront. And I'm happy to come back and in the future and talk a lot more about kind of the evolution of Main Street styles at mid-century. So I'll just wrap up with kind of some ideas of where to start. If you're wanting to think about, kind of telling more stories in your community, think about what stories or communities are not represented in your surveys or your designations or, your walking tours or other information. Are there really missing voices, stories that haven't been told? Are there resources that are threatened? Is there something that's a particular community interest that you could, draw in the community through a project? Are there really significant events, organizations, or people to highlight? The photo here is of historic protests that took place in Denver, the Gang of 19 for disability rights. And that's something several, we're trying to work on in Civic Center Park in Denver, really getting that recognized. And it was really significant to the whole disability rights movement. And it's a story that really isn't told currently anywhere in Denver. And so we are trying to make sure that that does get recognized. Are there particular resources that you have access to, that you want to use? Are there, good photograph archives or oral histories or other, resources? And then also looking at what funding is available. Sometimes that funding can also drive, what kind of projects that we do as well. So I will wrap it up there, and I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has questions.
I just want to thank you, Abby. That was awesome. And believe it or not, as long as I've been around preservation and you, I actually learned at least one thing. I didn't realize that something that only had local significance could be on the National Register. For some reason, I thought it had a rise to national significance. No idea where I got that from, but I'm glad that you educated me on that today. The other thing that and that I've long talked about, but I don't think I've ever put it in the perspective about how the teeth are at the local level, and but so when people are thinking about, hey, we've got this National Register building in our community and they're thinking that it's safe. I don't think I've ever put that spin on it. I think it's always been like, no, you don't have to be afraid of designation. It's all at the local level. But it's like, but you also really do have to think about that protection. If you're thinking, hey, we got this wonderful National Historic church or, house, if you don't have a local ordinance, that it could go away.
It could go at any time without a local ordinance. And the federal government really set it up that way, that they wanted local communities to be able to determine what was of significance to them. So they set it out. They gave them the power that they could do the ordinances to, do whatever protections they want. But yeah, it's really left up to the local communities.
Yeah, so Abby, on that, is there any kind of document that or resource that you would know of, or just advice that you would have when talking with communities that are reluctant to join the CLG program or reluctant to establish some kind of a protective ordinance or maintenance ordinance for that matter? Um,
I would say if they're hesitant, a great place to start is just with doing advisory reviews. Like you don't have to do like Park County is a CLG, and at least unless it's changed recently, is just advisory review. So there, what it is that, you're doing that design review process, but you're not regulating it. People that are doing a project come to a historical review board. They, get advice from the historical review board, but they're not mandated to follow it, which is a way that sometimes communities who have opposition to regulation can kind of ease into it, or at least be providing advice to property owners, even if they're not regulating building use.
right on. Yeah, that's
But
something.
also, I'd say it's a great, also just have it regulatory for the people that want to designate their property. That's the thing, if somebody is saying, yes, I want to designate my property and I'm happy to have regulations put on it, well, then that's also, that property owner's property rights that they want to be able to designate their property. So also, if you just stick to doing designations that are owner supported, that can also be a way for kind of communities, that are afraid of pushback or, afraid of, private property rights issues to get started as well.
Are there any, I know this is a little bit outside of the box, but a lot of communities, not a lot, but in some Main Street communities and sometimes even in bigger cities, facade easements are put into place so that essentially city money could be utilized to do work on facades when the property owners often can't, to at least bring things up to a maintenance standard or something like that. Is there a case to be made for that, you think, in our smaller communities? And, I know that we get back to the property rights, but it just could be a new advice to actually get folks good advice. Maybe I could help with that. Maybe they hire another architect or something. But have you seen that at all across the country?
Not as familiar with them on Main Street buildings. You're using it in that way with the city holding it. I think a lot of it just depends on the city, to have a successful easement program. I think easement programs can be great, but you need to make sure that you have the willpower to like enforce them and to do the regular, yearly checkups and everything. But easements are a great tool. They're an awesome tool for protecting buildings. So I think that, yeah, doing something like facade easements are a great tool. In Denver, both the state holds some various easements. Historic Denver also holds easements. It's like when we're doing design review, we're also often working, sometimes in partnership with whoever also holds an easement on that property.
Sure. Yeah, and that's outside, so that's a different kind of teeth right there too, right? Like that's not
Yeah.
regulated
Easements,
locally.
yeah.
Okay,
Easements are another kind of teeth. Yeah.
cool.
And of course, the other
And if
thing
you do something like if you get a state historic fund grant, those usually come with a requirement to have an easement so that the state knows that if they put their money into it, that it's going to stay intact.
I was going to say, and this was going to say is like that's where the other teeth is either locally or if you take taxpayer money to do your improvements, whether that's the state historical fund or tax credits. So, any other questions for Abby? I know there's just a few of us on the call. Any interest in hearing more from her about architectural styles and what was the other thing that you were, I know I was going to say me, but that you'd been talking about, Abby?
Talking about how like typical modernization trends in the 1950s and how a lot of main streets evolved in the 50s and 60s.
Go, yes. I saw Kat and I saw Larry. Well, anyway, thank you again, Abby, for joining us. Just so much knowledge, and I
Sure.
just love it when you're sharing. And thanks everyone for joining us. And if you have any questions for Abby that pop up afterwards, I know how to get in touch with her. So, but in the meantime, I will get this recording out to everybody as well. And have a fabulous day. And thanks for your recommendations, Brenda.
Yeah. Thanks again, Abby.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.